I'm Ross Atkins, welcome to Outside Source. We're going to start with new statistics from the World Health Organization. It's recorded the biggest 24-hour increase in coronavirus cases since the pandemic began. Most of the new cases are in Latin America and the US. We're going to report from Washington and from Sao Paulo. The victims of Saturday night's attack in Reading have been named. They were three friends sitting out on a summer's evening. We'll hear about the lives so tragically taken. Coronavirus advice is being shifted in England for over 2 million people who are shielding because of health vulnerabilities. The new guidance will be eased in 2 weeks' time. We'll look into that. And we'll have a look at the detail of why slaughterhouses have been at the centre of a number of COVID-19 outbreaks. Well, lest any of us think this pandemic is entering its final stages, the World Health Organization has recorded the highest rise in coronavirus cases since the pandemic began. On Sunday, 183,000 people around the world were confirmed to have COVID-19. The global total of confirmed cases is now close to 9 million, bringing the total number who've had it, well, as I was saying, to 9 million. Interestingly, though, here's the WHO on whether these rising infection rates mean some countries shouldn't ease their lockdowns.
Some countries that have successfully suppressed transmission are now seeing an upswing in cases as they reopen their societies and economies. All countries are facing a delicate balance between protecting their people while minimizing the social and economic damage. It's not a choice between lives and livelihoods. Countries can do both.
Well, the country with the most infections remains the United States. 120,000 people there have lost their lives, and the number of infections in the US went up by more than 36,000 on Sunday. The total is now around 2.2 million. The infection rate in New York, though, is falling. As I'm sure you know, the city was the centre of the US outbreak initially. Now it is starting to reopen. The news, though, is not so good in the south and the west of the US, where numbers are rising. Florida and Arizona recorded their highest increase in infections over the weekend. And these states now seem to be on a similar trajectory to the one we saw in the northeast of the US through April and May. And the most important headline figure, the whole infections across the US in May, well, they fell in May and they're rising again. Let's bring in Anthony Zurcher, live with us from Washington, D.C. Anthony, can we spot any patterns with regards to where the virus seems to be surging the most? What reasons might there be?
Well, it definitely seems to be surging in states that have been easing off their shelter-in-place restrictions and allowing businesses to reopen. So places like Texas and Florida and California and Arizona. I mean, it is interesting that these are a lot of southern states, but then again, those were states that weren't hit the hardest early on. New York obviously has seen their cases decline, but that's because they had a high number of cases initially. So I think what you're seeing is people are beginning to stop wearing masks, beginning to start socializing again, beginning to go out to businesses again, and as a result, the virus cases are starting to go back up again.
And can we map how the different states have eased their lockdowns next to their politics? Is there a correlation there?
Well, you know, like I mentioned, California is one of the cases, one of the states that has seen a rise in cases. California is a entirely Democratic-controlled state. Meanwhile, Arizona, Texas, Florida, they're controlled by Republicans. So, you know, there's much more of a relationship between the decisions to ease off on these business closure and shelter-in-place orders rather than the politics of the individual states in question. You know, if you look at Arizona, which is showing one of the largest spikes, they did not have any mask restrictions. They didn't. They began opening very early on. The governor of Arizona just announced last week that he was going to let local officials start to make decisions about whether to require masks in public and whether businesses should be able to continue to have more and more people come in. But when you have local governments doing that, then you could have a kind of a patchwork of response throughout the state and that it is going to be unlikely to be able to arrest the growth of the virus at this point. Gottlieb, who is a former FDA head, he came out and said, looking at Arizona in particular, said that we could reach the point here in that state soon where these kind of gentle mitigation efforts like mask wearing aren't going to be enough. You're seeing hospitalizations go up, you're beginning to see people put on ventilators, the numbers going up, and then it's only a matter of time when death rates start to go up.
Okay, Anthony, thank you very much. Let's switch our attention from the US to Brazil, because there more than 50,000 people have now died from COVID-19 and the number of new cases is still rising sharply. Brazil recorded more than 54,000 new infections on Sunday and its total is now past 1 million. And given its low testing rate, the figure could be considerably higher. Even so, President Bolsonaro remains committed to reopening the Brazilian economy. Our correspondent Katie Watson covers Brazil. Here's some of her latest report from Sao Paulo.
It was just a little cold, said Brazil's president, when the crisis started. And even as the infections soared and the death toll climbed, Jair Bolsonaro carried on. I'm no gravedigger, he quipped in April as he was questioned over the numbers. A week later, he was taken to task again. So what, he answered, I'm no miracle worker. As the situation worsens, the president continues to focus on reopening the economy and says little to ease the pain of those who've lost loved ones.
Brazil's hit 2 more grim milestones in a matter of days. More than 1 million cases and more than 50,000 people dead. But not even these numbers are prompting the president to change course. In the middle of a pandemic, many Brazilians feel they're lacking leadership, and the numbers keep going up and up.
Well, let's look elsewhere in Latin America. In Peru, new infections increased by more than 3,500 on Sunday. Its total is past 250,000, and it has the highest rate of infection after Brazil. Chile and Ecuador are also struggling, and along with Brazil and Peru, all four average 20 to 25 people dying out of every 100,000 of population. Mexico's just behind that, with 15 to 20 out of every 100,000 people dying. The infection rate is rising there too, bearing in mind just under half of all states in Mexico, including Mexico City, is still in the red zone. That's the highest alert, with bars and cinemas closed, sports events cancelled. You might be surprised to know those figures. Let's get more detail on this. Will Grant is one of the BBC's Latin America correspondents. Will, why is it still not in control in Mexico, given that it seems to be doing what it should be doing?
Well, it does in one sense, but somebody I was speaking to, a Mexican analyst this weekend, said to me, in a sense, normal life is carrying on. I think what quite a few of those countries you've mentioned in your list there have in common is their high levels of poverty, their very rural populations and their very sparse populations too, and obviously great poverty in their urban centres as well. And for a lot of those people, not working, staying at home, locking down with your family simply can mean not eating. So we're seeing, for example, the rates in Peru that we saw, the problems in Mexico that you say are sort of right hot on the heels behind of Brazil, are partly, I believe, coming from the fact that people are still going out to work in various forms. A friend of mine in Tijuana, for example, on the border with the US, said really lockdown here hasn't been respected at all. So I do think that is a big part of the problem.
Let me also ask you about Cuba, Will, because there's a country having a lot more success in controlling the virus. I guess it has a geographical head start on many countries.
It does. That's part of it. It acted very early, but also, it has a lot of experience in dealing with infectious diseases. It's very proud of its record on things like Zika and its medical system in general. And of course, on some of those things like ordering lockdown, because of the fact it's obviously a police state and run by an autocratic government, if they say don't step outside, or when you step outside you must wear a face mask, people are doing it because obviously there are serious consequences to not doing so. So it's obviously being followed through on a lot more harshly, but it is absolutely having a much better effect. They had 3 infections in the past 24 hours and just 2 deaths out of the past 18 days. So Cuba is absolutely on top of the problem.
Well, thank you very much. There's much more information on the situation in Latin America on the BBC News website. Now, here in the UK, all 3 victims of Saturday's stabbings in Reading have now been named, as well as James Furlong, a teacher in Wokingham, who was described as inspirational. His friend Joe Ritchie Bennett also died. He was a 39-year-old American who had lived in the UK for 15 years. His family in Philadelphia say they're heartbroken. And finally, another friend who'd been enjoying the summer's evening in the park, David Wales. With more, here's our correspondent, Rajini Vaidyanathan.
Back at school for the most painful of reasons. Through the morning, they left tributes to a teacher who always told his pupils to fly high. 36-year-old James Furlong was the head of history and politics at Holt School. With news of his death still sinking in, students and colleagues held a 2-minute silence.
As a Holt community, we all now need to absorb this sad news. Our thoughts are with his mum, his dad, his brother and his family, and his friends and colleagues. He was a cherished colleague and he will be very sadly missed. Thank
you. He wasn't just every average teacher, he was an incredible person. And he wasn't just a teacher, he was a human being. And he had family and friends that loved him just as much as we do.
14-year-old Lucy last saw Mr. Furlong at a history lesson before lockdown.
Well, first he told us everything was going to be fine, Corona's going to end and we're going to see him again. But we're not really, are we? We're not going to see him again.
Former pupils also came to pay their respects to someone they describe as an unforgettable teacher.
I came back today because I feel like I had a really personal connection with Mr. Furlong. He was one of the teachers who was always there for me. The person who tried to put a smile on everyone's faces. He used to come in and dress up as Henry VIII. He had really funny catchphrases. He always made us laugh.
James Furlong was in this park in Reading on Saturday when he was stabbed to death. Today it was confirmed his friend Joe Ritchie Bennett was killed alongside him. An American who lived in the UK for 15 years. He lost his husband to cancer several years ago. BBC Radio Berkshire presenter Sarah Walker was a close friend. She delivered this on-air tribute.
And it matters to me today that you know that Joe lived a great life. He was loved by so many people, and he made us all feel that life was a much better place with him in it.
Tonight, the third victim of the attack has also been named, 49-year-old David Wales.
He was always happy. Everyone had their problems, but he always left that at the door when he walked into the pub. It always made people smile.
3 friends who'd just gone for a catch-up in the sunshine. 3 lives taken for no reason.
Well, in a few minutes on Outside Source, we're going to hear about some wildlife researchers who want to study how animals have been reacting to lockdown and the fact that we haven't been around quite as much. Victoria Gill is going to talk us through what exactly an anthropause is. Now, if you're one of the over 2 million people in England who's been shielding because of a pre-existing health condition, restrictions are easing in a fortnight and ending at the start of August. You'll be able to meet 6 people outdoors and form support bubbles with other households. In Scotland, the restrictions will continue until at least the same time, the start of August. That's when Northern Ireland's restrictions are due to come to an end. The Welsh Government says restrictions will continue until mid-August. This means many clinically vulnerable people could be heading back to work. There's concern about whether that is safe. Here's the UK's Health Secretary.
It's so important that employers work with us and, crucially, work with their employees to support them to get back to work in a COVID-secure environment. And it's critical that work is provided in a COVID-secure way for people who are shielding.
I'm Ros Atkins with Outside Source. We're here in the BBC Newsroom. There's been a record number of new coronavirus cases in one day. 183,000 cases have been registered by the WHO. Third person killed in the Reading stabbings has been named. David Wales died along Joe Ritchie Bennett and his friend James Furlong on Saturday. Now, in the context of the coronavirus, there's been a lot of attention recently on slaughterhouses and how some have been the centre of COVID outbreaks. For example, this meat processing plant in Germany, more than 1,300 positive cases have been linked to the factory and 7,000 employees and their families are now in quarantine. The outbreak's so large that on its own it's helped to push up the R number in Germany. That's the measure of how fast the virus is spreading. Scientists want to see that figure under 1. In Germany, it's risen to over 2.8. Now, the plant's in northwest Germany. Its management says the outbreak may have begun when workers travelled to Eastern Europe at the end of Germany's lockdown. Maybe, but focus has shifted to the working conditions at the plant too. The owner is the billionaire Clemens Tons, and he held a press conference over the weekend.
As a businessman and someone who puts people first, I can only offer my complete apologies because we are the cause of this issue and carry full responsibility, me as a businessman and the company as a whole.
Now, let's be clear, this focus on meat processing plants is not isolated to Germany. Outbreaks have forced plants to shut in other parts of Europe, in the Americas and in Australia. Here in the UK, for example, 3 sites were closed last week after clusters of infections were discovered. 150 people tested positive at a bacon plant in Cleckheaton. There have been further outbreaks at a food plant in Wrexham and elsewhere in Wales at the Two Sisters plant in Anglesey. That's the UK's biggest chicken factory. All 560 workers are now self-isolating. Now, none of this is necessarily a huge surprise. Conditions inside slaughterhouses make them ideal breeding grounds for COVID-19, and there are lots of different factors at play here. The US agency, the CDC, has documented some of them. It describes cramped conditions along processing lines, long hours in close proximity to workers, plus the layout on factory floors, all being barriers to social distancing. It adds that the pace of work and the physical demands make it difficult to wear face coverings at all times. Other research is being carried out into noise. This was conducted by a team in London. It looks at how the presence of loud noise can bring physical workers closer in some circumstances. And socioeconomic factors are well documented too. We know, for example, that in Europe and the US, the meat industry relies on cheap migrant labour. Many travel to work by bus or in shared cars, making it easier for the disease to spread. Communication presents another challenge. The CDC points out that in one factory in the US, 40 different languages are spoken. We also saw this FT article, which uses Germany as a case study. Working up to 60 hours a week, it says the migrants live 7 to 8 per accommodation provided by subcontracting agencies. And there's one other important factor, the cold environment at these plants. Here's one virologist on that.
So the cold temperature doesn't help because we know that humidity and heat helps destroy the virus. So that means that the virus will be on surfaces for longer, which therefore increases the potential for transmission. But really, when it looks at the epidemiological factors that are most involved in transmission, it's density of people. So it really is the number of people in one place for an extended period of time.
Now, this issue is acute in the US. Nearly 200 meatpacking plants have reported outbreaks. For example, in Indiana, 900 employees at a pork factory caught the virus. More than 800 were infected at another facility in South Dakota, and 8 people died from COVID-19 in Greeley, Colorado. Here's another statistic to digest. According to the Food and Environment Reporting Network, 20,000 meatpacking workers in the US have fallen ill, all of which has put pressure on food supplies. Back in April, Donald Trump used presidential powers to force some meat processing factories to stay open, citing national security reasons. Well, let's go back to Anthony Zurcher in Washington. Is it overstating, Anthony, to say this single issue is applying pressure to the food supply chain?
Absolutely. It's not only, with these facilities shutting down because of outbreaks with them, but when they're reopening again, the process has to be changed to ensure workers' safety. So the production rate declines, and that causes backlogs in the supply chain all the way to, from the people who are producing the pork, raising the hogs and beef, to the grocery stores in the neighborhood. So when you get disruptions in the supply chain, two things happen. One, you get less of the supply, so there aren't as many pieces of meat on the shelves in stores, and also prices gone up. And you've seen both those things happen in the U.S. over the past couple months. Although I will say recently it seems like the chain has been restored somewhat, so the supply at least has increased, if not the prices going down.
And does the meat processing industry in the US accept that it has a particular issue with reference to COVID?
Oh, I think they do acknowledge that that there is a threat to workers' safety. You see each company handle it a little bit differently, and of course, the Trump administration, as you mentioned, in April came in with that order under the Defense Production Act saying that this was critical infrastructure and essentially prevented states and localities from imposing additional requirements on these meat production facilities beyond what was recommended by the federal government. If you talk to meatpacking producers, they say they're doing everything they have to. They're doing everything that's necessary to protect this health and safety of their workers, although there are worker unions and advocacy groups that are saying that there's still not enough, that people are still getting sick, that they're being forced to get back to work or forego a paycheck, and that they are essentially sacrificing their health in order to ensure their financial security.
Well, Anthony, thank you very much. There's Anthony once again in Washington, D.C. Now, let me quickly take you through some of the day's other main news. BBC Arabic is covering Saudi Arabia's announcement that it will be holding what it calls a very limited Hajj this year because of the coronavirus. Only pilgrims already in the kingdom will be allowed to take part. The Afghan government says last week was the deadliest for security forces in the last 19 years. It's accused the Taliban of killing nearly 300 members of its security forces during more than 400 attacks. The Taliban described the claims as propaganda to disrupt the peace process. That's from the BBC's Afghan services. Tens of thousands of South African commuters have been left stranded by a strike by minibus drivers. Major roads in Johannesburg and Pretoria were blocked. The drivers are demanding more financial support from the government, saying coronavirus restrictions have reduced their income. That's from BBC Africa. Now, you may well have seen there have been plenty of stories of animals behaving differently during lockdown, and with us out of the way, some animals have been making the most of it. Well, researchers have a name for all of this, an anthropause, and they're urging further study of what's been happening. Well, our science correspondent Victoria Gill is joining us to talk about this. Hi, Victoria. What is an anthropause?
Well, it's this kind of unique, unprecedented, I think is probably the most overused word in the reporting of the pandemic, but this is an unprecedented lack of human activity. So, through huge human and economic cost, through the most tragic of circumstances, we've sort of pushed the pause button on human movement and activity through lockdown all over the world. So what these scientists are saying, and they're wildlife scientists who are basically involved in tracking animal movement and looking at how we share the planet with lots of other species in every continent all over the world. What they're saying is that we need to bring together that data where all these different species have been tracked so that we can really measure exactly what's gone on before, during and after lockdown. We can measure the impact of our own absence because, as you can imagine, on an increasingly crowded planet, it is very difficult to measure human absence, and here's a unique opportunity.
What kind of things do you think they're expecting to find?
Well, it's all about what they're keen to understand is how we might take lessons from lockdown and make some easy and attainable changes that might have a good impact for wildlife and nature. So we know, and scientists fully expect, that, say, the road network being so very quiet is going to be very good for a lot of species, especially migrating species, terrestrial land animals that can move around much more easily. There's going to be a lot less roadkill. They're even suggesting, some scientists are suggesting that might have population scale impacts for species like hedgehogs in the UK, for example, where they reckon about a third of those animals per year. The third of the mortality of those animals per year is on the roads. So we know that it's potentially going to have some beneficial impacts. What they're looking at is where the biggest impacts are. So if you find certain spaces while you're tracking animals or where that movement increases and where you get some beneficial effects, then maybe that's where you could put in a wildlife corridor or a crossing, or maybe that's where you could reshape the transport network a little bit so that we could take some of those beneficial impacts out of lockdown and into the future, so we can sort of share our space a lot more successfully.
And I've only a few seconds, Victoria, but presumably there's a flip side to this, a detriment, which is as lockdown eases, all these animals who'd got used to one thing have to get used to it changing again.
Yeah, we would expect that the transport in particular and all that the roads would get busier. So that's the real aim, is to take some long-term lessons from this.
All right, Victoria, thank you very much indeed. Be interested to talk once that work has been done on how nature has responded to us disappearing for a little while and then returning. Remember, there's much more on all the stories we cover through the BBC News app and the BBC News website, bbc.com/news. I'll see you for the next edition of Outside Source in half an hour's time.